everybody to Mr. Charles Denby, portrayed by Mark Steffenhagen. If we can get everybody in here.
Get everybody in close enough so you can hear me. We'll wait for last people. Okay, does anybody in this group smoke cigars? Chris, you smoke cigars?
When I'm with friends on fishing trips. But
Has anybody seen the Denby? Almost everybody's seen the cigar box like this. And if you open it up, there's a picture of Charles Denby, that's me. And it says here, air vented bed, which they're talking about the cigar people. They're not talking about me. It also says that I was minister to China in 1885 to 1898, and I was on the Philippine Commission. I got to tell you, I have nothing to do with the cigars. I didn't make them. I didn't profit by the making of the cigars. I didn't grow tobacco. In fact, I didn't even smoke cigars as far as I know. But I was friends with the Fendrich family, and they owned the cigar company, and they honored me with this back in late 1800s, and it continued on up until probably in the 1960s, or sometime maybe even later than that. So anyhow, my name is Charles Denby. I was born in Virginia, Mount Joy, Virginia in 1830. My ancestors served in the Revolutionary War. They served with Lee's Legions. My father was in the shipping industry, and for 3 years I accompanied him to France, where he was on a trade mission. And while I was there, I learned to speak fluent French. I also had some military training there. When I returned, I attended Georgetown College. I was a very good student. I also finished my education at Virginia Military Institute, VMI, which was called the West Point of the South. I graduated with honors when I was 20 years old in 1850. So at that point, I was ready to take on the world. So instead, I moved to Selma, Alabama, and I taught military tactics in a small college. It wasn't exactly like I thought that I could contribute to the world. And so after 3 years, I decided to move to Evansville. So this is 1853. Evansville was only a town of 6,000, but I could see that there was promise here because it was on the Ohio River, and it was the terminus of the Wabash and Erie Canal. When I moved to Evansville, I bought a part interest in the local newspaper, and I was a lifelong Democrat, and so I started writing editorials that they promoted the Democratic cause. I also started studying the law, and I became a lawyer. I joined a law firm here. And I continued to be active in the Democratic Party. Right about in 1856, I ran for political office, my one and only time, and I served one term in the Indiana legislature, the House of Representatives. I had two big accomplishments that I can be proud of. Number one, I introduced a resolution which put to vote the annexation of the west side of Evansville, which was Lamasco and the west side. So either you can blame me or give me all the credit for that, depending on where you live. The second big accomplishment that I did is I met my future wife, who was my companion for the rest of my life. She's buried right here. Her name was Martha Fitch. She was the daughter of Indiana's senator at the time. So we moved back to Evansville, and of course this is coming up on the Civil War. When Fort Sumter was fired upon, I immediately closed my law office, and I formed a militia of the local men around here, and I trained them because I had a military background. I trained them in military tactics, and we were given responsibility for guarding the local supply of gunpowder, which was on the north side of town. And then when Governor Morton called for a regiment to be formed from southern Indiana, we became the 42nd Indiana. This is my hat and my uniform, my flags. The men of the 42nd Indiana, like I say, were mainly from Evansville and the surrounding areas. You've passed many of them already on your trip. Your first stop might have been Googe. George Googe was a member of 42nd Indiana. When you walk to the next one, you probably walked right over the grave of James Jones, who was named the colonel of the 42nd Indiana. I was named lieutenant colonel, second in command. And then right at the top of the hill, you passed Jim Shanklin. He was the third in command. He was major. Unfortunately, he didn't survive the war. But he was a Democratic lawyer, just like myself. We knew each other. Right behind you in this Civil War section, I think I counted 5 members of the 42nd that are buried there. And then if you look on this hill, about a stone's throw away, if you got a really good arm, were 2 very famous members of the 42nd. Johnny Messick and his father. Johnny Messick was all of 9 years old when he enlisted, and he was too small to load a rifle, and so he became the drummer boy for the 42nd Indiana. We thought at the time that he was the youngest Union soldier of all the soldiers. We learned later that there were 2 other boys that had him beat by a couple months. So he was about the youngest soldier in the Union Army. I'll tell you just a quick story about the 42nd. Early in the war, when we were marching through Tennessee, just outside of Nashville, we were going along a country road, and we passed a farmhouse. And on this farmhouse were 2 women that were waving a handmade Confederate flag, and they were shouting at the tops of their lungs, "Hoorah for Jeff Davis and hoorah for the Confederate States of America." And our men couldn't ignore it, and some of them were taking exception to it. And so we had a tense moment on our hands, and I was afraid that somebody would call for them to be arrested, or I was afraid somebody might fire a shot. And so I had to think quick. I called the men to a halt on the line here. Called them to a halt. I had them right face, so now the entire line was facing these ladies, and the ladies didn't back down. They continued to shout this. So I gave an order that surprised even myself and probably surprised all the men. I said, 3 cheers for the brave women of Tennessee. And of course, we gave the 3 cheers, and what could the women do? It took all the air out of their sails. The men got a laugh out of it, and we continued to march on our way. A little bit later, in 1862, October of 1862, we had our first big battle. It was in Perryville, Kentucky. If you know the battlefield, if you've ever been there, it's kind of rolling hills, kind of similar to this. Made it really difficult to see where the enemy was. It also made it difficult to hear. So even though the Union had them outnumbered 3-1, it was an equal fight, and nobody really ended up winning that battle. The men of the 42nd suffered heavily from it. We had 145 casualties in that battle, including myself. I was wounded twice in the leg, hit by mini balls. I had several holes in my jacket where there were near misses, and the horse was shot out from under me. So when I was recovering after the battle in the hospital, I was given command, I was promoted and given command of the 80th Indiana Regiment, which was also from southern Indiana. It was formed a little bit later. But I never got to really serve with them much because right after I recovered from my wounds, I received a medical discharge from service because I had recurring leg cramps. Now, a lot of my political opponents said that I resigned because I didn't agree with the Emancipation Proclamation, which was enacted right at the same time. I never denied those arguments. I never gave them the credit of acknowledging their claims. After I returned from my military service, at that time I continued to be active in the Democratic Party. I continued to work on my law office. I became a very successful lawyer, and of course I also was a family man. Several of my children are buried behind this stone right here. Then in 1886, I was a member of the Democratic National Convention, where we nominated Grover Cleveland to become president. And of course Grover Cleveland won, and he rewarded me by naming me Minister to China. So I was Minister to China from 1885 to 1898, 13 years, which was the longest time anybody had been Minister to China up to that point. During that time, China was at war with Japan, and I'm very proud that I was part of the negotiations to form a peace treaty between the two countries. And I also worked with Mr. Foster, who's buried up on the hill on that peace treaty. So we're kind of all here together. Unfortunately, of course, Southeast Asia was an unsettled area, and after I left my post there, of course they had the Boxer Rebellion, they had the Chinese Revolution, the Communist Revolution, World War II, World War I. It was a very unsettled area, but I was kind of the first one to establish a U.S. presence in Asia. And I also was on the Philippine Commission, like I said before, where we kind of established the Philippines as our ally. After the war, I came back to Evansville again, somewhat semi-retired. I went back to writing, which I always loved to do. I wrote a book about my experience in China. I started going on a lecture tour where I would talk about my time in China, and I would talk especially to Christian missionaries about the opportunities that I saw in China. And in fact, that's how I died. I was on a trip to New York in 1904, and I was going to be speaking to a group of ministers about potentially going over to China on a missionary expedition, and I died suddenly. My body was returned to Evansville. They closed the courts for 2 days in honor of me, and that's kind of my story. So if anybody's got a question, yes, thank you.
Is that cigar box